I did not understand your letter of this morning, this I told you because it was the case. I understand that of this evening, do not imagine I shall ever return an answer to it, I am too anxious to forget what it contains, and although you excite my pity, I am not proof against the bitterness with which it has filled my mind. I descend to trick and cunning with you. I accused of the blackest of all infamies. Adieu, I regret your having the adieu. I know not what I say adieu, I shall be very anxious to forgive you. You will come when you please, you will be better received than your suspicions deserve. All I have to desire of you is not to trouble yourself about my reputation. The opinion of the world concerning me is of but little importance in my esteem. My conduct is good, and this is sufficient for me. Besides, I am ignorant of what has happened to the two persons who are dear to me as they are to you. This last letter extricated me from a terrible embarrassment, and threw me into another of almost the same magnitude. Although these letters and answers were sent and returned the same day with an extreme rapidity, the interval had been sufficient to place another between my rage and transport, and to give me time to reflect on the enormity of my imprudence. Madame d'Hautot had not recommended to me anything so much as to remain quiet, to leave her the care of extricating herself, and to avoid, especially at that moment, all noise and rupture, and I, by the most open and atrocious insults, took the properest means of carrying rage to its greatest height in the heart of a woman who was already but too well disposed to it. I now could naturally expect nothing from her but an answer so haughty, disdainful, and expressive of contempt, that I could not, without the utmost meanness, do otherwise than immediately quit her house. Happily she, more adroit than I was furious, avoided, by the manner of her answer, reducing me to that extremity. But it was necessary either to quit or immediately go and see her, the alternative was inevitable. I resolved on the latter, though I foresaw how much I must be embarrassed in the explanation. For how was I to get through it without exposing either Madame d'Hautot or Teresa? And woe to her whom I should have named. There was nothing that the vengeance of an implacable and an intriguing woman did not make me fear for the person who should be the object of it. It was to prevent this misfortune that in my letter I had spoken of nothing but suspicions, that I might not be under the necessity of producing my proofs. This, it is true, rendered my transports less excusable, no simple suspicions being sufficient to authorize me to treat a woman, and especially a friend, in the manner I had treated Madame d'Épinay. But here begins the noble task I worthily fulfilled of expiating my faults and secret weaknesses by charging myself with such of the former as I was incapable of committing, and which I never did commit. I had not to bear the attack I had expected, and fear was the greatest evil I received from it. At my approach, Madame d'Épinay threw her arms about my neck, bursting into tears. This unexpected reception, and by an old friend, extremely affected me. I also shed many tears. I said to her a few words which had not much meaning, she uttered others with still less, and everything ended here. Supper was served, we sat down to table, where, in expectation of the explanation I imagined to be deferred until supper was over, I made a very poor figure, for I am so overpowered by the most trifling inquietude of mind that I cannot conceal it from persons the least clear-sighted. My embarrassed appearance must have given her courage, yet she did not risk anything upon that foundation. There was no more explanation after than before supper, none took place on the next day, and our little tete-a-tete conversations consisted of indifferent things, or some complimentary words on my part, by which, while I informed her I could not say more relative to my suspicions, I asserted, with the greatest truth, that, if they were ill-founded, my whole life should be employed in repairing the injustice. She did not show the least curiosity to know precisely what they were, nor for what reason I had formed them, and all our peacemaking consisted, on her part as well as on mine, in the embrace at our first meeting. Since Madame d'Épinay was the only person offended, at least in form, I thought it was not for me to strive to bring about an éclaircissement for which she herself did not seem anxious, and I returned as I had come, continuing, besides, to live with her upon the same footing as before. I soon almost entirely forgot the quarrel, and foolishly believed she had done the same, because she seemed not to remember what had passed. This, it will soon appear, was not the only vexation caused me by weakness, but I had others not less disagreeable which I had not brought upon myself. The only cause of these was a desire of forcing me from my solitude, by means of tormenting me. These originated from Diderot and the D'Holbecians. That is to take from it the old woman who was wanted in the conspiracy. It is astonishing that, during this long quarrel, my stupid confidence prevented me from comprehending that it was not me but her whom they wanted in Paris. Since I had resided at the Hermitage, Diderot incessantly harassed me, either himself or by means of Delaire, and I soon perceived from the pleasantries of the latter upon my ramblings in the groves, with what pleasure he had travestied the hermit into the gallant shepherd. But this was not the question in my quarrels with Diderot. The cause of these were more serious. After the publication of Phil's Naturel he had sent me a copy of it, which I had read with the interest and attention I ever bestowed on the works of a friend. In reading the kind of poem annexed to it, I was surprised and rather grieved to find in it, amongst several things, disobliging but supportable against men in solitude, this bitter and severe sentence without the least softening, ilnyk le méchant que soit seul. This sentence is equivocal, and seems to present a double meaning, the one true, the other false, since it is impossible that a man who is determined to remain alone can do the least harm to anybody, and consequently he cannot be wicked. The sentence in itself therefore required an interpretation, the more so from an author who, when he sent it to the press, had a friend retired from the world. It appeared to me shocking and uncivil, either to have forgotten that solitary friend, or, in remembering him, not to have made from the general maxim the honorable and just exception which he owed, not only to his friend, but to so many respectable sages, who, in all ages, have sought for peace and tranquility in retirement, and of whom, for the first time since the creation of the world, a writer took it into his head indiscriminately to make so many villains. I had a great affection and the most sincere esteem for Diderot, and fully depended upon his having the same sentiments for me. But tired with his indefatigable obstinacy in continually opposing my inclinations, taste, and manner of living, and everything which related to no person but myself, shocked at seeing a man younger than I was wish, at all events, to govern me like a child, disgusted with his facility in promising, and his negligence in performing, weary of so many appointments given by himself, and capriciously broken, while new ones were again given only to be again broken, displeased at uselessly waiting for him 3 or 4 times a month on the days he had assigned, and in dining alone at night after having gone to St. Denis to meet him, and waited the whole day for his coming, my heart was already full of these multiplied injuries. This last appeared to me still more serious, and gave me infinite pain. I wrote to complain of it, but in so mild and tender a manner that I moistened my paper with my tears, and my letter was sufficiently affecting to have drawn others from himself. It would be impossible to guess his answer on this subject. It was literally as follows: I am glad my work has pleased and affected you. You are not of my opinion relative to hermits. Say as much good of them as you please, you will be the only one in the world of whom I shall think well. Even on this there would be much to say were it possible to speak to you without giving you offense. A woman 80 years of age, etc. A phrase of a letter from the son of Madame d'Épinay which, if I know you well, must have given you much pain, has been mentioned to me. The last 2 expressions of this letter want explanation. Soon after I went to reside at the Hermitage, Madame Levasseur seemed dissatisfied with her situation, and to think the habitation too retired. Having heard she had expressed her dislike to the place, I offered to send her back to Paris, if that were more agreeable to her, to pay her lodging, and to have the same care taken of her as if she remained with me. She rejected my offer, assured me she was very well satisfied with the Hermitage, and that the country air was of service to her. This was evident, for, if I may so speak, she seemed to become young again, and enjoyed better health than at Paris. Her daughter told me her mother would, on the whole, have been very sorry to quit the Hermitage, which was really a very delightful abode, being fond of the little amusements of the garden and the care of the fruit of which she had the handling, but that she had said, what she had been desired to say, to induce me to return to Paris. Failing in this attempt, they endeavored to obtain by a scruple the effect which complaisance had not produced, and construed into a crime my keeping the old woman at a distance from the succors of which, at her age, she might be in need. They did not recollect that she, and many other old people, whose lives were prolonged by the air of the country, might obtain these succors at Montmorency, near to which I lived, as if there were no old people, except in Paris, and that it was impossible for them to live in any other place. Madame Levasseur, who ate a great deal, and with extreme voracity, was subject to overflowings of bile and to strong diarrheas, which lasted several days, and served her instead of clysters. At Paris she neither did nor took anything for them, but left nature to itself. She observed the same rule at the Hermitage, knowing it was the best thing she could do. No matter, since there were not in the country either physicians or apothecaries, keeping her there must, no doubt, be with the desire of putting an end to her existence, although she was in perfect health. Diderot should have determined at what age, under pain of being punished for homicide, it is no longer permitted to let old people remain out of Paris. This was one of the atrocious accusations from which he did not accept me in his remark, that none but the wicked were alone, and the meaning of his pathetic exclamation with the etc., which he had benignantly added, a woman of 80 years of age, etc. I thought the best answer that could be given to this reproach would be from Madame Levasseur herself. I desired her to write freely and naturally her sentiments to Madame d'Épinay. To relieve her from all constraint, I would not see her letter. I showed her that which I am going to transcribe. I wrote it to Madame d'Épinay upon the subject of an answer I wished to return to a letter still more severe from Diderot, and which she had prevented me from sending. Thursday. My good friend, Madame Levasseur is to write to you. I have desired her to tell you sincerely what she thinks. To remove from her all constraint, I have intimated to her that I will not see what she writes, and I beg of you not to communicate to me any part of the contents of her letter. I will not send my letter because you do not choose I should, but, feeling myself grievously offended, it would be baseness and falsehood, of either of which it is impossible for me to be guilty, to acknowledge myself in the wrong. Holy Writ commands him to whom a blow is given, to turn the other cheek, but not to ask pardon. Do you remember the man in comedy who exclaims, while he is giving another blows with his staff, "This is the part of a philosopher"? Do not flatter yourself that he will be prevented from coming by the bad weather we now have. His rage will give him the time and strength which friendship refuses him, and it will be the first time in his life he ever came upon the day he had appointed. He will neglect nothing to come and repeat to me verbally the injuries with which he loads me in his letters. I will endure them all with patience. He will return to Paris to be ill again, and, according to custom, I shall be a very hateful man. What is to be done? Endure it all. But do not you admire the wisdom of the man who would absolutely come to St. Denis in a hackney coach to dine there, bring me home in a hackney coach, and whose finances, 8 days afterwards, obliges him to come to the Hermitage on foot? It is not possible, to speak his own language, that this should be the style of sincerity. But were this the case, strange changes of fortune must have happened in the course of a week. I join in your affliction for the illness of Madame, your mother, but you will perceive your grief is not equal to mine. We suffer less by seeing the persons we love ill than when they are unjust and cruel. Adieu, my good friend, I shall never again mention to you this unhappy affair. You speak of going to Paris with an unconcern, which, at any other time, would give me pleasure. I wrote to Diderot, telling him what I had done, relative to Madame Levasseur, upon the proposal of Madame d'Épinay herself, and Madame Levasseur having, as it may be imagined, chosen to remain at the Hermitage, where she enjoyed a good state of health, always had company, and lived very agreeably. Diderot, not knowing what else to attribute to me as a crime, construed my precaution into one, and discovered another in Madame Levasseur continuing to reside at the Hermitage, although this was by her own choice, and though her going to Paris had depended, and still depended upon herself, where she would continue to receive the same succors from me as I gave her in my house. This is the explanation of the first reproach in the letter of Diderot. That of the second is in the letter which follows. The learned man, a name given in a joke by Grimm to the son of Madame d'Épinay, must have informed you there were upon the rampart 20 poor persons who were dying with cold and hunger, and waiting for the farthing you customarily gave them. This is a specimen of our little babbling, and if you understand the rest it will amuse you perhaps. My answer to this terrible argument, of which Diderot seemed so proud, was in the following words. I think I answered the learned man, that is, the farmer general, that I did not pity the poor whom he had seen upon the rampart, waiting for my farthing, that he had probably amply made it up to them, that I appointed him my substitute, that the poor of Paris would have no reason to complain of the change, and that I should not easily find so good a one for the poor of Montmorency, who were in much greater need of assistance. Here is a good and respectable old man, who, after having worked hard all his lifetime, no longer being able to continue his labors, is in his old days dying with hunger. My conscience is more satisfied with the 2 sous I give him every Monday, than with the 100 farthings I should have distributed amongst all the beggars on the rampart. You are pleasant men, you philosophers, while you consider the inhabitants of the cities as the only persons whom you ought to befriend. It is in the country men learn how to love and serve humanity, all they learn in cities is to despise it. Such were the singular scruples on which a man of sense had the folly to attribute to me as a crime my retiring from Paris, and pretended to prove to me by my own example, that it was not possible to live out of the capital without becoming a bad man. I cannot at present conceive how I could be guilty of the folly of answering him, and of suffering myself to be angry instead of laughing in his fare. However, the decisions of Madame d'Épinay and the clamors of the coterie Halbachik had so far operated in her favor, that I was generally thought to be in the wrong, and the Dowdtot herself, very partial to Diderot, insisted upon my going to see him at Paris, and making all the advances towards an accommodation which, full and sincere as it was on my part, was not of long duration. The victorious argument by which she subdued my heart was, that at that moment Diderot was in distress. Besides the storm excited against the Encyclopédie, he had then another violent one to make head against, relative to his piece, which, notwithstanding the short history he had printed at the head of it, he was accused of having entirely taken from Goldoni. Diderot, more wounded by criticisms than Voltaire, was overwhelmed by them. Madame de Grassigny had been malicious enough to spread a report that I had broken with him on this account. I thought it would be just and generous publicly to prove the contrary, and I went to pass 2 days, not only with him, but at his lodgings. This, since I had taken up my abode at the Hermitage, was my second journey to Paris. I had made the first to run to poor Goffacourt, who had had a stroke of apoplexy, from which he has never perfectly recovered. I did not quit the side of his pillow until he was so far restored as to have no further need of my assistance. Diderot received me well. How many wrongs are effaced by the embraces of a friend? After these, what resentment can remain in the heart? We came to but little explanation. This is needless for reciprocal invectives. The only thing necessary is to know how to forget them. There had been no underhand proceedings, none at least that had come to my knowledge. The case was not the same with Madame d'Épinay. He showed me the plan of the Père de Famille. This, said I to him, is the best defense to the fils naturel. Be silent, give your attention to this piece, and then throw it at the head of your enemies as the only answer you think proper to make them. He did so, and was satisfied with what he had done. I had 6 months before sent him the first 2 parts of my Eloisa to have his opinion upon them. He had not yet read the work over. We read a part of it together. He found this fulet, that was his term, by which he meant loaded with words and redundancies. I myself had already perceived it, but it was the babbling of the fever. I have never been able to correct it. The last parts are not the same. The 4th especially, and the 6th, are masterpieces of diction. The day after my arrival, he would absolutely take me to sup with M. de Holbach. We were far from agreeing on this point, for I wished even to get rid of the bargain for the manuscript on chemistry, for which I was enraged to be obliged to that man. Diderot carried all before him. He swore d'Holbach loved me with all his heart, said I must forgive him his manner, which was the same to everybody, and more disagreeable to his friends than to others. He observed to me that, refusing the produce of this manuscript, after having accepted it 2 years before, was an affront to the donor which he had not deserved, and that my refusal might be interpreted into a secret reproach, for having waited so long to conclude the bargain. I see, added he, Dalbach every day, and know better than you do the nature of his disposition. Had you reason to be dissatisfied with him? Do you think your friend capable of advising you to do a mean thing? In short, with my accustomed weakness, I suffered myself to be prevailed upon, and we went to sup with the Baron, who received me as he usually had done. But his wife received me coldly and almost uncivilly. I saw nothing in her which resembled the amiable Caroline, who, when a maid, expressed for me so many good wishes. I thought I had already perceived that since Grimm had frequented the house of Dane, I had not met there so friendly a reception. Whilst I was at Paris, Saint Lambert arrived there from the army. As I was not acquainted with his arrival, I did not see him until after my return to the country, first at the Chevrette, and afterwards at the Hermitage, to which he came with Madame de Hautot, and invited himself to dinner with me. It may be judged whether or not I received him with pleasure. But I felt one still greater at seeing the good understanding between my guests. Satisfied with not having disturbed their happiness, I myself was happy in being a witness to it, and I can safely assert that, during the whole of my mad passion, and especially at the moment of which I speak, had it been in my power to take from him Madame de Hautot, I would not have done it, nor should I have so much as been tempted to undertake it. I found her so amiable in her passion for Saint Lambert, that I could scarcely imagine she would have been as much so had she loved me instead of him, and without wishing to disturb their union, all I really desired of her was to permit herself to be loved. Finally, however violent my passion may have been for this lady, I found it as agreeable to be the confidant, as the object of her amours, and I never for a moment considered her lover as a rival, but always as my friend. It will be said this was not love, be it so, but it was something more. As for Saint Lambert, he behaved like an honest and judicious man. As I was the only person culpable, so was I the only one who was punished. This, however, was with the greatest indulgence. He treated me severely, but in a friendly manner, and I perceived I had lost something in his esteem, but not the least part of his friendship. For this I consoled myself, knowing it would be much more easy to me to recover the one than the other, and that he had too much sense to confound an involuntary weakness and a passion with a vice of character. If even I were in fault in all that had passed, I was but very little so. Had I first sought after his mistress? Had not he himself sent her to me? Did not she come in search of me? Could I avoid receiving her? What could I do? They themselves had done the evil, and I was the person on whom it fell. In my situation they would have done as much as I did, and perhaps more, for, however estimable and faithful Madame de Hautot might be, she was still a woman, her lover was absent, opportunities were frequent, temptations strong, and it would have been very difficult for her always to have defended herself with the same success against a more enterprising man. We certainly had done a great deal in our situation, in placing boundaries beyond which we never permitted ourselves to pass. Although at the bottom of my heart I found evidence sufficiently honorable in my favor, so many appearances were against me, that the invincible shame always predominant in me, gave me in his presence the appearance of guilt, and of this he took advantage for the purpose of humbling me. A single circumstance will describe this reciprocal situation. I read to him, after dinner, the letter I had written the preceding year to Voltaire, and of which Saint Lambert had heard speak. Whilst I was reading he fell asleep, and I, lately so haughty, at present so foolish, dared not stop, and continued to read whilst he continued to snore. Such were my indignities and such his revenge, but his generosity never permitted him to exercise them, except between ourselves. After his return to the army, I found Madame de Hautot greatly changed in her manner with me. At this I was as much surprised as if it had not been what I ought to have expected. It affected me more than it ought to have done, and did me considerable harm. It seemed that everything from which I expected a cure, still plunged deeper into my heart the dart, which I at length broke in rather than draw out. I was quite determined to conquer myself, and leave no means untried to change my foolish passion into a pure and lasting friendship. For this purpose I had formed the finest projects in the world, for the execution of which the concurrence of Madame de Hautot was necessary. When I wished to speak to her I found her absent and embarrassed. I perceived I was no longer agreeable to her, and that something had passed which she would not communicate to me, and which I have never yet known. This change, and the impossibility of knowing the reason of it, grieved me to the heart. She asked me for her letters. These I returned her with a fidelity of which she did me the insult to doubt for a moment. This doubt was another wound given to my heart, with which she must have been so well acquainted. She did me justice, but not immediately. I understood that an examination of the packet I had sent her made her perceive her error. I saw she reproached herself with it, by which I was a gainer of something. She could not take back her letters without returning me mine. She told me she had burnt them. Of this I dared to doubt in my turn, and I confess I doubt of it at this moment. No, such letters as mine to her are never thrown into the fire. Those of Eloisa have been found ardent. Heavens! What would have been said of these? No, no, she who can inspire a like passion will never have the courage to burn the proofs of it. But I am not afraid of her having made a bad use of them. Of this I do not think her capable, and besides I had taken proper measures to prevent it. The foolish, but strong apprehension of raillery had made me begin this correspondence in a manner to secure my letters from all communication. I carried the familiarity I permitted myself with her in my intoxication so far as to speak to her in the singular number, but what thing in thouing? She certainly could not be offended with it. Yet she several times complained, but this was always useless. Her complaints had no other effect than that of awakening my fears, and I besides could not suffer myself to lose ground. If these letters be not yet destroyed, and should they ever be made public, the world will see in what manner I have loved. The grief caused me by the coldness of Madame de Hautot, and the certainty of not having merited it, made me take the singular resolution to complain of it to Saint Lambert himself. While waiting the effect of the letter I wrote to him, I sought dissipations to which I ought sooner to have had recourse. Fêtes were given at the Chevrette for which I composed music. The pleasure of honoring myself in the eyes of Madame de Hautot by a talent she loved, warmed my imagination, and another object still contributed to give it animation. This was the desire the author of the Devon Du Village had of showing he understood music, for I had perceived some persons had, for a considerable time past, endeavored to render this doubtful, at least with respect to composition. My beginning at Paris, the ordeal through which I had several times passed there, both at the house of M. de Pan and that of M. de la Popelinière, the quantity of music I had composed during 14 years in the midst of the most celebrated masters and before their eyes, finally, the opera of the Muses Galantes, and that even of the Devon, a motet I had composed for Mademoiselle Fell, and which she had sung at the spiritual concert, the frequent conferences I had had upon this fine art with the first composers, all seemed to prevent or dissipate a doubt of such a nature. This however existed even at the Chevrette, and in the mind of M. d'Épinay himself. Without appearing to observe it, I undertook to compose him a motet for the dedication of the chapel of the Chevrette, and I begged him to make choice of the words. He directed de Linant, the tutor to his son, to furnish me with these. De Linant gave me words proper to the subject, and in a week after I had received them the motet was finished. This time, spite was my Apollo, and never did better music come from my hand. The words began with Ecce seds hic tonantis. I have since learned these were by Santoul, and that M. de Linant had without scruple appropriated them to himself. The grandeur of the opening is suitable to the words, and the rest of the motet is so elegantly harmonious that everyone was struck with it. I had composed it for a great orchestra. D'Épinay procured the best performers. Madame Bruna, an Italian singer, sung the motet, and was well accompanied. The composition succeeded so well that it was afterwards performed at the spiritual concert, where, in spite of secret cabals, and notwithstanding it was badly executed, it was twice generally applauded. I gave for the birthday of M. d'Épinay the idea of a kind of piece half dramatic and half pantomimical, of which I also composed the music. Grimm, on his arrival, heard speak of my musical success. An hour afterwards not a word more was said on the subject, but there no longer remained a doubt, not at least that I know of my knowledge of composition. Grimm was scarcely arrived at the Chevrette, where I already did not much amuse myself, before he made it insupportable to me by airs I never before saw in any person, and of which I had no idea. The evening before he came, I was dislodged from the chamber of favor, contiguous to that of Madame d'Épinay. It was prepared for Grimm, and instead of it, I was put into another further off. In this manner, said I, laughingly, to Madame d'Épinay, newcomers displace those which are established. She seemed embarrassed. I was better acquainted the same evening with the reason for the change, in learning that between her chamber and that I had quitted there was a private door which she had thought needless to show me. Her intercourse with Grimm was not a secret either in her own house or to the public, not even to her husband, yet, far from confessing it to me, the confidant of secrets more important to her, and which was sure would be faithfully kept, she constantly denied it in the strongest manner. I comprehended this reserve proceeded from Grimm, who, though entrusted with all my secrets, did not choose I should be with any of his. However prejudiced I was in favor of this man by former sentiments, which were not extinguished, and by the real merit he had, all was not proof against the cares he took to destroy it. He received me like the Comte de Taffir, he scarcely deigned to return my salute, he never once spoke to me, and prevented my speaking to him by not making me any answer, he everywhere passed first, and took the first place without ever paying me the least attention. All this would have been supportable had he not accompanied it with a shocking affectation, which may be judged of by one example taken from 100. One evening Madame d'Épinay, finding herself a little indisposed, ordered something for her supper to be carried into her chamber, and went upstairs to sup by the side of the fire. She asked me to go with her, which I did. Grimm came afterwards. The little table was already placed, and there were but 2 covers. Supper was served, Madame d'Épinay took her place on one side of the fire, Grimm took an armchair, seated himself at the other, drew the little table between them, opened his napkin, and prepared himself for eating without speaking to me a single word. Madame d'Épinay blushed at his behavior, and, to induce him to repair his rudeness, offered me her place. He said nothing, nor did he ever look at me. Not being able to approach the fire, I walked about the chamber until a cover was brought. Indisposed as I was, older than himself, longer acquainted in the house than he had been, the person who had introduced him there, and to whom as a favorite of the lady he ought to have done the honors of it, he suffered me to sup at the end of the table, at a distance from the fire, without showing me the least civility. His whole behavior to me corresponded with this example of it. He did not treat me precisely as his inferior, but he looked upon me as a cipher. I could scarcely recognize the same Grimm, who, at the house of the Prince de Saxe-Gotha, thought himself honored when I cast my eyes upon him. I had still more difficulty in reconciling this profound silence and insulting haughtiness with the tender friendship he professed for me to those whom he knew to be real friends. It is true the only proofs he gave of it was pitying my wretched fortune, of which I did not complain, compassionating my sad fate, with which I was satisfied, and lamenting to see me obstinately refuse the benevolent services, he said, he wished to render me. Thus was it he artfully made the world admire his affectionate generosity, blame my ungrateful misanthropy, and insensibly accustomed people to imagine there was nothing more between a protector like him and a wretch like myself, than a connection founded upon benefactions on one part and obligations on the other, without once thinking of a friendship between equals. For my part, I have vainly sought to discover in what I was under an obligation to this new protector. I had lent him money, he had never lent me any, I had attended him in his illness, he scarcely came to see me in mine, I had given him all my friends, he never had given me any of his, I had said everything I could in his favor, and if ever he has spoken of me it has been less publicly and in another manner. He has never either rendered or offered me the least service of any kind. How, therefore, was he my Maecenas? In what manner was I protected by him? This was incomprehensible to me, and still remains so. It is true, he was more or less arrogant with everybody, but I was the only person with whom he was brutally so. I remember Saint Lambert once ready to throw a plate at his head, upon his, in some measure, giving him the lie at table by vulgarly saying, "That is not true." With his naturally imperious manner he had the self-sufficiency of an upstart, and became ridiculous by being extravagantly impertinent. An intercourse with the great had so far intoxicated him that he gave himself airs which none but the contemptible part of them ever assume. He never called his lackey but by a, as if amongst the number of his servants my lord had not known which was in waiting. When he sent him to buy anything, he threw the money upon the ground instead of putting it into his hand. In short, entirely forgetting he was a man, he treated him with such shocking contempt, and so cruel a disdain in everything, that the poor lad, a very good creature, whom Madame d'Épinay had recommended, quitted his service without any other complaint than that of the impossibility of enduring such treatment. This was the la fleur of this new presuming upstart. As these things were nothing more than ridiculous, but quite opposite to my character, they contributed to render him suspicious to me. I could easily imagine that a man whose head was so much deranged could not have a heart well placed. He piqued himself upon nothing so much as upon sentiments. How could this agree with defects which are peculiar to little minds? How can the continued overflowings of a susceptible heart suffer it to be incessantly employed in so many little cares relative to the person? He who feels his heart inflamed with this celestial fire strives to diffuse it, and wishes to show what he internally is. He would wish to place his heart in his countenance, and thinks not of other paint for his cheeks. I remember the summary of his morality which Madame d'Épinay had mentioned to me and adopted. This consisted in one single article, that the sole duty of man is to follow all the inclinations of his heart. This morality, when I heard it mentioned, gave me great matter of reflection, although I at first considered it solely as a play of wit. But I soon perceived it was a principle really the rule of his conduct, and of which I afterwards had, at my own expense, but too many convincing proofs. It is the interior doctrine Diderot has so frequently intimated to me, but which I never heard him explain. I remember having several years before been frequently told that Grimm was false, that he had nothing more than the appearance of sentiment, and particularly that he did not love me. I recollected several little anecdotes which I had heard of him by M. de Franqueuil and Madame de Chenonceau, neither of whom esteemed him, and to whom he must have been known, as Madame de Chenonceau was daughter to Madame de Roquecourt, the intimate friend of the late Comte de Frise, and that M. de Franqueuil, at that time very intimate with the Viscount de Polignac, had lived a good deal at the Palais Royal precisely when Grimm began to introduce himself there. All Paris heard of his despair after the death of the Comte de Frise. It was necessary to support the reputation he had acquired after the rigors of Mademoiselle fell, and of which I, more than any other person, should have seen the imposture, had I been less blind. He was obliged to be dragged to the Hôtel des Castries, where he worthily played his part, abandoned to the most mortal affliction. There, he every morning went into the garden to weep at his ease, holding before his eyes his handkerchief moistened with tears, as long as he was in sight of the hotel, but at the turning of a certain alley, people, of whom he little thought, saw him instantly put his handkerchief in his pocket and take out of it a book. This observation, which was repeatedly made, soon became public in Paris, and was almost as soon forgotten. I myself had forgotten it. A circumstance in which I was concerned brought it to my recollection. I was at the point of death in my bed, in the Rue de Grenelle. Grimm was in the country. He came one morning, quite out of breath, to see me, saying he had arrived in town that very instant, and a moment afterwards I learned he had arrived the evening before, and had been seen at the theatre. I heard many things of the same kind, but an observation, which I was surprised not to have made sooner, struck me more than anything else. I had given to Grimm all my friends without exception. They were become his. I was so inseparable from him, that I should have had some difficulty in continuing to visit at a house where he was not received. Madame de Crequy was the only person who refused to admit him into her company, and whom for that reason I have seldom since seen. Grimm on his part made himself other friends, as well by his own means, as by those of the Comte de Frise. Of all these not one of them ever became my friend. He never said a word to induce me even to become acquainted with them, and not one of those I sometimes met at his apartments ever showed me the least goodwill. The Comte de Frise, in whose house he lived, and with whom it consequently would have been agreeable to me to form some connection, not accepted, nor the Comte de Schomberg, his relation, with whom Grimm was still more intimate. Add to this, my own friends, whom I made his, and who were all tenderly attached to me before this acquaintance, were no longer so the moment it was made. He never gave me one of his. I gave him all mine, and these he has taken from me. If these be the effects of friendship, what are those of enmity? Diderot himself told me several times at the beginning that Grimm, in whom I had so much confidence, was not my friend. He changed his language the moment he was no longer so himself. The manner in which I had disposed of my children wanted not the concurrence of any person. Yet I informed some of my friends of it, solely to make it known to them, and that I might not in their eyes appear better than I was. These friends were 3 in number: Diderot, Grimm, and Madame d'Épinay. Duclos, the most worthy of my confidence, was the only real friend whom I did not inform of it. He nevertheless knew what I had done. By whom? This I know not. It is not very probable the perfidy came from Madame d'Épinay, who knew that by following her example, had I been capable of doing it, I had in my power the means of a cruel revenge. It remains therefore between Grimm and Diderot, then so much united, especially against me, and it is probable this crime was common to them both. I would lay a wager that Duclos, to whom I never told my secret, and who consequently was at liberty to make what use he pleased of his information, is the only person who has not spoken of it again. Grimm and Diderot, in their project to take from me the governesses, had used the greatest efforts to make Duclos enter into their views, but this he refused to do with disdain. It was not until some time afterwards that I learned from him what had passed between them on the subject, but I learned at the time from Teresa enough to perceive there was some secret design, and that they wished to dispose of me, if not against my own consent, at least without my knowledge, or had an intention of making these 2 persons serve as instruments of some project they had in view. This was far from upright conduct. The opposition of Duclos was a convincing proof of it. They who think proper may believe it to be friendship. This pretended friendship was as fatal to me at home as it was abroad. The long and frequent conversations with Madame Levasseur, for several years past, had made a sensible change in this woman's behavior to me, and the change was far from being in my favor. What was the subject of these singular conversations? Why such a profound mystery? Was the conversation of that old woman agreeable enough to take her into favor, and of sufficient importance to make of it so great a secret? During the 2 or 3 years these colloquies had, from time to time, been continued, they had appeared to me ridiculous, but when I thought of them again, they began to astonish me. This astonishment would have been carried to inquietude had I then known what the old creature was preparing for me. Notwithstanding the pretended zeal for my welfare of which Grimm made such a public boast, difficult to reconcile with the airs he gave himself when we were together, I heard nothing of him from any quarter the least to my advantage, and his feigned commiseration tended less to do me service than to render me contemptible. He deprived me as much as he possibly could of the resource I found in the employment I had chosen, by decrying me as a bad copyist. I confess he spoke the truth, but in this case it was not for him to do it. He proved himself in earnest by employing another copyist, and prevailing upon everybody he could, by whom I was engaged, to do the same. His intention might have been supposed to be that of reducing me to a dependence upon him and his credit for a subsistence, and to cut off the latter until I was brought to that degree of distress. All things considered, my reason imposed silence upon my former prejudice, which still pleaded in his favor. I judged his character to be at least suspicious, and with respect to his friendship I positively decided it to be false. I then resolved to see him no more, and informed Madame d'Épinay of the resolution I had taken, supporting it with several unanswerable facts, but which I have now forgotten. She strongly combated my resolution without knowing how to reply to the reasons on which it was founded. she had not concerted with him, but the next day, instead of explaining herself verbally, she, with great address, gave me a letter they had drawn up together, and by which, without entering into a detail of facts, she justified him by his concentrated character, attributed to me as a crime my having suspected him of perfidy towards his friend, and exhorted me to come to an accommodation with him. This letter staggered me. In a conversation we afterwards had together, and in which I found her better prepared than she had been the first time, I suffered myself to be quite prevailed upon, and was inclined to believe I might have judged erroneously. In this case I thought I really had done a friend a very serious injury, which it was my duty to repair. In short, as I had already done several times with Diderot, and the Baron de Halbach, half from inclination, and half from weakness, I made all the advances I had a right to require. I went to M. Grimm, like another George Dandin, to make him my apologies for the offense he had given me, still in the false persuasion, which, in the course of my life has made me guilty of 1,000 meannesses to my pretended friends, that there is no hatred which may not be disarmed by mildness and proper behavior, whereas, on the contrary, the hatred of the wicked becomes still more envenomed by the impossibility of finding anything to found it upon, and the sentiment of their own injustice is another cause of offense against the person who is the object of it. I have, without going further than my own history, a strong proof of this maxim in Grimm, and in Tronchin. Both became my implacable enemies from inclination, pleasure, and fancy, without having been able to charge me with having done either of them the most trifling injury, and whose rage, like that of tigers, becomes daily more fierce by the facility of satiating it.